Hello and welcome back to my podcast, where I'm today delighted, genuinely delighted to be joined by Jack Sargent, who is, if I was going to describe you, Jack, I'd sort of say you're kind of an expert in transgressive and cult films. But, well, firstly, hello, and then secondly, what would you, if someone said to you at a party, what do you do? What would you say?
That's a good question. I'm contrary to when I was younger, I'm actually kind of increasingly shy and self-conscious about talking what I do because I just see, I just like, how do you frame what you do? And in many ways, I'm very cautious about it. So I guess, yeah, I mean, I started off writing books about, as you say, transgressive culture and transgressive films and so on. But I also, I beyond that, I curate and I put on film festival or work at a film festival. I put on film shows. Over the years, I've done various readings, curated art shows, and so on. So I do all these different things, and they all come out of the same kind of place, but they're all very different. So, and I'm really aware that in some spaces, if I talk about writing books, people just look blank, and then other places, if I talk about films, people look blank. So it's a kind of when I'm asked at a party, I just kind of fudge an answer.
Fair enough, fair enough. But you write books, you curate stuff. I'm quite fascinated by all that world, certainly the curating stuff, because I just know nothing about it. So we'll definitely come back to that. But I normally start off asking people about their growing up, and particularly with one eye on how you think growing up might have influenced where you are now and what you're interested in. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so obviously I'm a kid of the 70s. And I was born in South London, in Croydon. Uh, and I don't really, I remember bits and pieces, but I remember the Rag and Bone Man,
Oh,
oddly enough.
yeah, yeah, so do I.
God, possibly one of my earliest memories with his horse and cart, steptoe and son kind of thing.
Mm.
And I remember the landlord coming around and knocking on the door and asking for the rent as well. And these are odd memories I have, I think, from being really young. And my parents are very young as well. They're both about, God, I think 19, 20 years older than me. So there's not a huge, which is obviously when you're a kid, it seems vast. But as an adult, realizing that I was being raised by people in their 20s is quite peculiar.
Yeah,
Uh, and so I had quite young parents, and they separated when I was 8, and we moved. I moved my mum to Brighton, my brother to Brighton, uh, where I lived for 30 years subsequently. It's a very nice place to live. It's very easy to live there. You've got the beach, you've got the countryside, and you've got London 50 minutes away on the train. So, I spent a lot of my formative years there. And obviously going back and forth to London as well, having separated parents. Uh, but in Brighton, back in this would have been 77, something like that. Coming from a broken home was kind of, it wasn't a common, it didn't feel like a common thing. Uh, so I kind of felt like an outsider. And I already had that kind of outsider thing anyway, and that didn't decrease as I got older. So the older I got, once you get into your teenage years, you start gravitating towards things that are formulating you, and you're formulating your thoughts around them. And I was probably 79, 80 when I was 11 or 12. Uh, it's those things that you remember, those gifts you were given as a kid. As a clock radio, everyone had those digital clock radios where
mm.
you had the numbers in red or green. And every night, I think it's probably my 11th or 12th birthday, I got it. And every night I go to bed at 10 o'clock and listen to John Peel. Uh, and that was like, and it is to everyone who we would know of our generation. It was a gateway. And yeah, you just remember that voice, and John Peel, he'd introduce something. One minute you're listening to The Fall, and then he's playing something by, you know, Toots and the Maytals or something, and then he's playing something by some punk band. Yeah, this whole kind of, you know, world opened up to me. The other thing is because I was a bit of an outsider and felt like a bit of an outsider, I didn't really connect with kids my own age. So I had older friends, like 2 years older, 3 years older. But when you're 11, 12, and your friends are 14, 15,
That's a lot.
that's a big thing. And they were, the kid I was hanging out with most had an older sister who was into music. So he was into music, so I was into music. And he turned me on when I was, 12, something like that, to all those things like industrial music, factory records thing. He was really big on the factory records thing. So, yeah, he had all those records. So I experimental electronic music and what I guess we now know as post-punk was always really there. And that was really opening stuff up for me from a really young age. And then, of course, the other thing that happened is my parents started getting, you could have a newspaper, a music paper, whichever one you want. So I started getting sounds. And I remember my bedroom wall, and I'm sure, again, everyone's wall was like this, all these cut out pictures glued on the walls and stuff of your favorite bands. But mine was like, like these punk bands and stuff. And because I was reading, they were really happy. I was immersed in culture. They were quite happy to buy me sounds every week. I think it was 40 pence or something. And then after a while, and this will be a divider with people. After a while, I decided I wanted to read NME instead. In retrospect, there's nothing in it, but at the time, it seemed like a move away from one thing and towards another.
I get that. Yeah, I do get that.
I never got the Melody Maker. But then my older friend would get both of those newspapers as well. So I get those music papers as well, read them through him. But he also had other things coming out like Flexi Pop. Do you remember Flexi Pop? It's played maybe slightly later, maybe 81. And it always had like a Flexi disc on the front cover. And that seemed to be a little engaged with kind of goth music. And then you had Zigzag. And then you had, God, what was the other one? Anyway, all these music magazines and stuff. So all this world was opening up. And that point at the late 70s, early 80s, it really felt like anything was possible. And I think that really informed how I was thinking. And growing up with that sense of limitlessness, that you can just do stuff, was a really liberating place to be. And I think that it was probably, I mean, we can all talk about the politics of the time, but it was almost certainly on some level a response to the kind of Thatcherism and what was going on politically in England, that you had this kind of really repressive government. There's a sense of, the Conservative Party doing what obviously they've got on to do even more. And you had this kind of counterculture of, it seemed like every young person, and you had this outpouring of music and culture almost as a response to it. So although it wasn't really I probably had the record at some point in my life, but stuff like the Specials and the Beat and those kind of two-tone bands were all responding to Thatcherism. But then you had like kind of noise bands like Throbbing Gristle, who responding to like a kind of version of British politics. And then you had like the anarcho stuff responding, and all this stuff was kind of feeding into my engagement with the world. And I was really motivated by that kind of sense of things being possible, that you could challenge what was dominating you. And I felt that sense of being able to challenge things was really important. And I think that just as a kid, as in your really 12, 13, 14 years old, that sense is so important. And then, of course, reading in the music magazines, you start becoming aware of other music that's also challenging things, and maybe not politically, but just artistically and so on. and all those things kind of just going into you and helping create a worldview, I guess. And that really established for me something about, thinking in a different way. And then, of course, allied to that, you had a sense of uh, uh, you'd read books. I think that there was only 3 TV stations, and Channel 4 launched, but there
Yeah.
was not a lot of TV. So it was basically, John Peel on the radio and going off to find weird books. And this is the story of every one of our generation and probably the previous generation, is you'd read an interview of a band and they talk about a book and you go and buy the book,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah.
David Bowie being the famous example of someone who turned people into books. But, you'd go and read, you kind of find a reading list out of records. And then the other thing was secondhand. There was loads of secondhand bookshops in Brighton at the time. And I remember you come home with all those books like all those pulp horror books like The Rats and stuff like that. All those James Herbert ones. And they were,
Yeah.
you passed those around the playground. So you had this great kind of combination of cultures happening of kind of punk music and kind of political sensibility emerging, and also a kind of pulp fiction kind of reading list that you'd be working your way through of like gore books and stuff, as in violence and gore books, like
Mm.
the Rats have found their lair and Survivor and all those things. And
Oh,
then
yeah.
there was
Yeah. Yeah.
it was such a big part of being a kid in the late 70s and early 80s, and so all of that was going in. And I'm sure that was part of this framework of feeling like an outsider, being immersed in this culture, and just listening to the radio, listening to records, hanging out with older kids who play you more records, and then reading weird books. And you start off reading horror books, but then you start investigating the books that people on records were talking about. So you find your William Burroughs or whatever, and it was a great time. Just secondhand books, piles of records, you know, and 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 not wanting to be a part of everything else.
Did it make you feel less of an outsider? Did it give you somewhere to belong?
See, that's my problem. In terms of like analysis, I'm sure this will be the root of everything. I never felt like I belonged anywhere, and I still don't. And so when I was like, I'm making dates up. At some point in the early 80s, tribes were forming, and they were probably always there, but I became more aware of tribes. So like you had the anarcho punks all in like old army clothes with hennaed hair. Then you had the goths in black with black leather jackets, and you had your skinheads, and then you had your mohawk punks and so on. And they always seemed like different tribes, and I was not interested in being in any tribe. So I would never affiliate. And I'm sure that I think on some level that stopped me fitting in anywhere because I didn't affiliate with anything. And yeah, I'm sure that affected me. So I still can't really affiliate with a particular subculture group. And I always was much more interested in people who were like just outsiders, just did not, and I never wanted. That's not true. I probably did want to affiliate. I probably wanted to be around things, but I didn't want to identify as a single group, a sect or something.
You could do that,
Uh,
couldn't you? You could be outside it all, but at the same time inside it as well. You could have a place within it that didn't require you to belong as such. Does that make
you
sense?
could have, you could have bit, but I remember I did get into. There was a few times at gigs where people would get a bit weird towards me.
Yeah.
I remember especially, I can't remember, it was one of the one of the anarcho punk bands, a gig with one of the anarcho punk bands, and a lot of the kind of people in army clothes with dreadlocks took umbrage with me because I was wearing a kind of black, kind of cramped Nick Cave kind of secondhand suit, and they were not amused by this. So, you know, you realize every one of these subcultures has its own rules and regulations. So yeah, I was aware that I was periodically probably in the wrong place.
Right. Yeah. So you're growing up, you're sort of a teenager now, etc., etc. What's the next kind of phase then? What's the next kind of milestone?
Oh well, so video narcissists is the next one. So once you grow up from reading the rats and stuff, yeah, what's next? You're, let's say 14, 15 years old, and you get the video explosion. Everyone's watching videos, and you get the government passing, going on about video nasties, and all those headlines like ban these sick films and stuff. So of course that was the next thing I wanted to go to, and that was probably where my interest in certain kinds of cinema came from. Was just going off to find, oh, this film's disgusting, I'm going to go and watch it. I've been told not to, and it's partly a youth thing that you've been told not to do something, so you want to. Partly it's that kind of rebellious urge you had when from punk and post-punk subcultures, and partly it's that from being an outsider and interested in horror and stuff, but also just getting a sense of the creativity that people were advocating wasn't necessarily the creativity that was particularly interesting. So the DIY thing of punk, the DIY thing of post-punk, where people were like, you know what, we can form a band where there's no bass, or we can form a band where there's just synthesizers, or we can form a band where we drum on bits of metal or whatever. And it's like you become aware that the conventional aesthetics that dominated culture weren't necessarily actually that valuable, and there's other forms of ways of expressing yourself. So when people said, oh, these horror films are really disgusting and they're really badly made and they're trashy, all those were things that were like, this sounds fantastic, this is exactly what I want. That's something that's going to annoy people, which is appeal to my teenage brain. It's something that's actually got different values from what was on at the cinema, and it was something that it became clear was actually kind of unique. So to me, that became something to search out. So I just I dove into watching weird films, and that was mid-teens. So you have this whole kind of balance of things happening: weird music, weird books, weird films. And there's all gateways into other things, because you've watched one thing and you're like, well, where did this idea come from? I want to go and find another film that's like this. I want to find out, this director said this. Why did he say this? One of the key things that happened in the early 80s was the magazine research. Like, fanzine seems like, it's not quite a fanzine, but it was. And that came out as a newspaper format. But by the third issue, it was a book format. And it was, you go to, see, I'm painting a picture of the olden days here somehow. Every town would have a hippie bookshop, an alternative bookshop. And those bookshops would say, one in Brighton was called Public House. And it was in Little Preston Street. And every town had one. You go in and there'd be like leaflets on the front desk for like anti-nuclear, anti-vivisection, stuff like that. Then there'd be some left-wing magazines. Then there was a section on First Nations people. Then there was like women's poetry. And then you walk around the counter and there was literature, cultural theory, and counterculture. And you go to that counterculture section, and it was like a shrine to a 16-year-old, 15-year-old. there was all the research books were there, the William Burroughs books were there, the Charles Bukowski books were there, Kathy Acker, all that stuff was there. And you would just kind of hone in on this and just start reading. So we bought all the research books. The reason we started buying the research books is because, well, firstly, they were really good, but secondly, they had probably the first one that you could readily get in Britain was one with William Burroughs and Throbbing Gristle. So, of course, as Throbbing Gristle fans, we all went down and bought this. And firstly, research in every interview, every artist in it ended with a book list and a video list and a record list. So you'd start going down and, it was, Cabaret Voltaire's favorite films and stuff like that. So it was like, all these lists, like I said earlier, were launching points. One of the researches that came out when I was in my late teens was Incredibly Strange Films. And it was interviews with weird filmmakers. So like people and they're not really weird at all, but that was kind of, how it's culturally considered. So people like Russ Meyer, stuff like that. Filmmakers who you hadn't really heard of, except, there might be a reference here or there. So you started reading this book and it just opened up a whole new world. And we already, were looking for weird videos and, so you just start diving deeper. At the same time, I started going to the cinema a lot, the Duke of York Cinema in Brighton. Back in this time, and again, it's every town had one, an art house cinema, and you get the program, and it would be like an A4 sheet that would unfold to be like 4 A4 sizes, so A2 or whatever, and everyone would have it kind of stuck on their refrigerator or their toilet door, and it would be like each week would be like a strip of film, and then as it seems impossible in this kind of day of multiplexes that show, the same Marvel film for week after week. It would have like Monday, Tuesday, there'd be one film in the day, then a different one in the evening. Wednesday, there'd be a different film in the day, different film in the evening, and maybe a late night or a late evening. And then Thursday, you'd have another 2 films. Then Friday, you'd have 2 films. Then you'd have a late night session at 11 o'clock, which would be a double bill. And you have the same on Saturday. Then you have the special film on Sunday. So you would be in the cinema all the time, just watching these films. And, the late night films was all these kind of B movies, horror films, cult films, independent films, and you would just be sucked into this world. So all that stuff was just like, perfect to grow up in. And I feel, that you could just grow up and just see this stuff. And you can still do this now online, which is great. People can get exposed to the art, but what you don't get is the culture in the same way. So we would be going to the cinema and you'd sit there on a Friday night, Saturday night at the late night, and there'd be all these people who were just like you, but they were all like, you didn't know them. But in what we were saying earlier about finding a community, and in some way that film nerds aren't a community in the same way that, people who follow a band are. But there's some sense of I'm not alone here. And you become aware that people were doing this stuff, and there was people who were interested in weird films and so on. So that, I guess, that would be that moment when I thought, oh yeah, this is something that is me in some way.
Were you?
That was 85, I think, 84, 85.
The way you've described it so far sounds like you were kind of hoovering up everything from everywhere, basically, and discovering all these incredible new worlds with new values, and imagine a world full of weirdos, how wonderful, etc. At what point does discernment come in?
Probably never.
Brilliant. Okay.
But, I think your discernment, it comes in all the time. Like you start thinking, you watch your first zombie film with heads exploding and it's great, but when you get to the 20th, you're like, yeah, okay, actually some of these ones aren't as good as this one. So it kind of, discernment you get from it builds up. It's some experience. It's like, you I don't think you can teach it. In some way you learn it. You learn that, your sense of taste kind of grows and develops. And I mean, one of the things I'm interested in now is I'm wary of nostalgia, but I'm aware of, people now talking about like something like anarcho punk in a different way who are our age. And I'm kind of interested in that because there was a moment where we were like, yeah, that's a bit silly. But now people are like, you know what? Maybe it wasn't. So I
Mm.
think that you go back and forth with taste. You look at things and then you get embarrassed by it, and then you think, actually, that was kind of cool. So discernment is a very fluid kind of concept. I think that you learn it, but then you also learn that your sense of good taste may well be wrong, and your taste should grow and change. And you know, there's
I
nothing wrong
guess
with open.
I guess one of the things that sort of triggered that in my mind was talking about video nasties and the accompanying hysteria in the mainstream media about what they're going to do to people's minds and all that sort of thing. Do you think there is any effect that long term kind of exposure to, for instance, extreme violence on film and so on can have? Do you think that does have an effect? Is it dangerous in any way?
I don't. How we define. So my first question is how we defining extreme violence. Like, is extreme violence like somebody with like
Mm,
tomato ketchup and stage blood being thrown around? Because you watch an old Hammer horror film and no one's going to say those were extreme violence. But certainly there's loads of stage blood flying around in some of them. So at what point, where do we say violence comes in? And one thing is like everyone's going to have different kind of thresholds and different moments. And I think that, I guess, to go to discernment, it's the moment you choose, like, you know what, I don't want to watch this because it's just gross or I don't like it. Uh, so maybe that's what discernment is. But I don't think that exposure to materials makes you. I don't think it affects you in a kind of literal sense. I think that. I mean, there's that idea of certain things that will affect you that aren't going to be the things you think are going to affect you. So, like, maybe you. So, okay, sometimes I'll notice a smell or something, and it will trigger a memory.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's not the thing itself; it's the smell. So the idea of, you know, I saw gore and then I thought of gore is too literal. I don't think your brain's like that. Uh, so I don't think it affects you. I think what affects you is far more complex than that. I think in terms of representations of violence in particular, we have to remember that for every trashy gore movie we watched growing up, I use trash as a not as a value, but just like the way it's considered. I don't think they are trash. I mean, that's how they're described. Uh, we the news would show an atrocity. And now I can't remember the details of some B movie I watched, but I can remember, the Falklands War on the news. I can remember the miners' strike. Uh, so I think that I think there's an awareness that we have of the difference between the representation of violence and real violence. And I think that that's something that's important to remember. And I think that all the stuff that these kind of movies and so on had, it, it was fictional violence. And I think that real violence is very different. And I also think it's important to remember that, especially in the period we're talking about, I mean, every time you went, there was a demonstration or a protest, there'd be people with like banners of or posters of Hiroshima and things like that. So it wasn't, violence was always in the mise en scène around you. So I don't think we can say it's from films or something. It was there, and maybe those films are almost an escape because it exaggerates it and makes it into something else.
Yeah.
But I think that the violence that affected me was the violence of everyday life, the violence of, the things like the miners' strike and stuff like that, where you saw violence in the news. And I think that uh, we have to be really cautious about how we think about these things like violence, because it's not just a cause and effect thing. I think it's far more complicated than that. I think it's far more nuanced than that. And I think that, I mean, there's that, every now and again you hear a moral panic now about violence in computer games or something. And it's like, you know what? Like, if I was 15 years old and playing a computer game where I was blowing things up, yeah, or I can be in the real world where climate change is destroying everything. And we're oh, well, kids shouldn't be playing these games. Maybe it should give them a sense of optimism in the future, So I think I'm very wary of saying, simplistic kind of cause and effect kind of logic around human behavior.
Yeah, fair
So,
comment. Fair comment. I suppose one of the things that's coming up in my head here, actually, which is too specific, so maybe shouldn't spend too long on this, but I was kind of, involved in that world with Crass and people like that. And simultaneously, you had the whole industrial thing with Throbbing Gristle. If we just, reduce it right down to those two bands as examples, for instance, there seemed to be, or it seemed to me, and I may be wrong because I don't know much about Throbbing Gristle really, but they seem quite amoral compared to the kind of Crass camp, who you could perhaps even say were moral to the point of sanctimony. But Throbbing Gristle sort of worried me a bit, really, and Psychic TV later as well, that there seems to be an amorality about that, which somehow seems to tie in my head with the amorality, if I'm right again, or if maybe wrong, of video nasties and things like that. Doing stuff for the hell of it, weird for the hell of weird.
I mean, that you could probably draw that comparison, but I don't think there's an amorality in Throbbing Gristle. I think there was an investigation. There was a kind of an engagement with those things, but I don't think exploring those things is the same way as not being aware of what you're doing. And I think they were exploring those things. And I mean, that we can now question from the point of view of, oh, well, was that valid or not? But I think they legitimately were engaging with that exploration. And I think that, I mean, it's a difficult one. I think with Throbbing Gristle, there was engagement with mechanisms of power in the same way there was with Crass, but Crass had a direct solution. But their direct solution of anarchy and peace, which I don't think many people would disagree with, is pretty never going to happen. It's a very easy slogan, but most of us aren't in a position to live in anarchy and peace.
Yeah.
Whereas I think that Throbbing Gristle bands like that were looking at the same world, but they didn't offer a solution. So when you talk about Crass being sanctimonious, I think that's kind of interesting, because I think they were offering an answer, which was an answer that was a really good answer when I was 12. But as I got a bit older, I was like, look, you just look out your window and, people don't want anarchy and peace. I mean, people are actually pretty scary. So I think that there was a simplicity there that was nice and fun and immediate, and you can't fault it. But as you get older, like 14, you realize it's not going to happen. It's the world isn't like that. So I think that there's that tension there. But I mean, there was lots of crossovers between those audiences. I think that
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of crossover, and I also think that I think that I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot of crossover, and I think they were in many ways looking at the same world, but they just had different solutions. As to amorality, I'm I think we I'm not sure what morality is, and I think that having a moral answer to things is in itself can also be problematic uh, and kind of evangelical. And there's loads of issues around what are morals and how do we create morals and where do they come from. And uh, I think that's a larger philosophical conversation. And I think that
Yeah. A
an
rabbit
easy,
hole.
an easy moral response isn't necessarily the right one. You know, to go to the crass anarchy and peace thing, what do you do when someone invades your country? You know, can you still have anarchy and peace? And I think that my inner 13-year-old would say, yeah, but as an adult, I'd be like, you know what? It's not quite like that, you know. So
Yeah.
does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, we're sort of, like I said, there's a whole rabbit hole that we could go down here. So I wasn't even sure whether I should bring that up at all, truthfully. But it does seem to somehow tie into all these different strands that were affecting you as you were growing up. That there was, and again, into discernment as well, because you have to start kind of making choices as you've just outlined, really, by you kind of get a bit older and you don't really kind of buy the crass in so much. And perhaps even at that point when throbbing gristle will become more of an interesting avenue to explore, because they're offering a response rather than an answer, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. That's a good point. And I think that lots of people had got to that point. Lots of people got to that point of which way they're going to go, you know. And I think that yeah, there was that whole idea of was punk too nihilistic kind of attitude, and you know that response to the nihilism of the first wave of punk and Crass being part of that. I guess if you want to stick with the punk metaphor, and also my biography, and also the sense of what I was listening to, I got much more interested in American hardcore at that point, like Black Flag and stuff.
Okay.
Uh, and I was interested because of that DIY ethic of the Americans, which I thought was more. It seemed more workable than the DIY ethic of Crass in some way. I'm not sure why, it just did. Uh, I find that really interesting. I think I probably got bored of going again to the response to the life in the early 80s. I found crowds to be really preachy after a while. I didn't need someone telling me that nuclear war was bad because it was pretty obvious nuclear war was a bad idea.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, and there's a certain point where you're like, do I need to be told this anymore? And I think and you know, that's Crass created an agenda where normal people, how we define that, started thinking about political alternatives. There's a reasonably good argument that things like CND, you know, all that stuff, a lot of people got involved with that because of Crass records. You know, a lot of people got involved in anti-apartheid and whatever because of that kind of political records of the early 80s. And I'm not going to fault those records for that. They got people politically active in things that I think were good to be politically active in, that, you know, against, you know, nuclear weapons or whatever. But I think that at the same time, it became really apparent to me that painting something on your jacket wasn't going to stop. wasn't going to stop. And yeah, anything. And there was more interesting ways to think about it. You know.
Um, I'm interested in now talking about how you kind of moved from just being interested in all this stuff to being a sort of, what's the right word, to being a player, to being a face. Those are two awful words. How you became kind of influential in this world, or even just how you started writing books and so on, really. How do you make that journey from sort of, being a consumer to being part of the ideas process?
I mean, I think I was always interested in ideas, and I was always writing little bits of things. So I think that just grew as I got older, and I was able to kind of focus it and hone it in on things. And then by the time I was in a position to write my first book, I was at, I knew people who would be able to help me, and I was introduced to my publisher and so on. And that it just all fell into place. And I think along with all the bands and stuff that were around, there was a lot of people doing, zines and publishing and so on. So I knew those people. I met those people because you did meet people. And I think that, once you're in your early 20s, you're able to articulate yourself a bit better, maybe. You're able to have an idea of how you want to express yourself. And I already had this kind of ammunition from DIY culture that you can just do this stuff. Oh, before that, of course, before I started doing that, I put on gigs for a while as well. So there's, but this bizarre world of the 80s, right, where the government gave you money to not be unemployed, and like they give you money to start your own business, so you get your dole money plus like £10 or something to start your own business, which was a
Enterprise
clear scam.
allowance scheme. Yeah.
Enterprise allowance scheme, a clear scam to keep unemployment figures down. But it meant that people like me and you and other people we know were able to like do what we were doing anyway and get 10 quid a week extra dole money.
Yeah, and not have to sign on. Yeah.
Yeah, you didn't have to go to the dole office. And like, so I did it putting bands on, and I put on a whole bunch of gigs, so I kind of had a network of people anyway. And then obviously I lived in share houses, and I lived in a house with people who were putting on gigs and had possibly the world's weirdest mail order record company, because they get the records on a Monday, they bring them to the house. As you will remember, everyone would just buy them in the house. They didn't even have to sell any in the mail. I don't think. It was, oh, you got the Butthole Surfers, everyone in the house would have a copy. I mean, it was, and I think everyone, there was that sense that everything was possible, as I was saying earlier about, that you got anyway from music and all this reading and books and fanzines. And once you got this, the government were going to give you a bit more money than your dole to do it. It just made sense to do something. So I got to meet all these. Yeah, I put on gigs. I put on some spoken word events, things like that. And then after that, I went to university. Somehow I decided I was going to go to university and actually not just do this. And I went to university, which gave me more of a sense of how to write and how to research and what I wanted to do. So I was able to put all these things together, I think, and that's how I started writing.
I don't remember you going to university. Where was that?
I went in London. It was 12. I was 21, I think. So maybe it was when we weren't living in Jersey Street. We were living in Upper Lewis Road then.
Okay, all right.
So we moved to a different part. I moved with my partner at the time to a different part of Brighton. And they really motivated me. My partner at the time motivated me to go to university as well. And and that, I think that really probably helped me quite a lot. Just having that motivation. The other thing is, I guess this is something else about the 70s and coming from a broken home and stuff. I was labeled as a nowhere at school. I was labeled, you're not going to go anywhere. And I went to school in Stanley Deason School in Whitehawk.
Right.
And I remember that I was reading I was a voracious reader, and it was stuff like the Rats and stuff. I also read, Kafka and all that stuff. They wouldn't let me do English literature at school. They thought I was too dumb. And it was a school where I was basically told I wasn't smart enough to do things. It took a lot. That affected me quite deeply, and it took a number of years for me to kind of find the self-confidence. Mm-hmm. And I think I feel that school has changed a lot now. I mean, I'm not sure what your school experience was like, but
hell,
yeah, school in the 70s, it was like, things that should be fun were punishment. Like I'm not sporty, but when you make people do sport, it's like you're gonna, all these kids like football and you're no good at it, so you're gonna be playing against them. That's not a way to motivate people to keep fit, It's like, and it's like there's just I feel that so much in education has changed. Thank God, so much has changed. But yeah, I felt that school they didn't, there was no sense that I could ever go to do anything that was maybe there was behind the scenes, but no one ever told me I could do anything. So I felt like a failure at school. I felt like I couldn't do stuff. So of course that added to my kind of general like lack of enthusiasm for doing it. And
Mm.
it took to the end of my teens when I realized I could actually. I went to school. After school, I did my A levels, and obviously I did really badly. Uh, and I went to night school and did them all again. I did okay, obviously, but it was like, you know, I feel that I feel that school was not right for me at that point, and the kind of education I got wasn't right for me, and they didn't make me feel like I could do anything. So by the time I felt like I could do stuff and went to university, I was incredibly motivated. You know, so I think that probably helped me as well. You know,
So was it after leaving university that you wrote your first book then?
so I did my undergraduate, then I did a master's, then I wrote my first book,
Right.
uh, which was Death Tripping, and that was weird because I said I'm going to write a book, and I did it, and it took a year. Now it takes me much longer to write a book, but that, I mean, you're young and everything's easy and fast. Uh, but that was the one that obviously, it was all about transgressive film, and that was the one that, I guess, the one that launched my career, and the one that people will always associate me with the word transgression for. And of course, that word has probably been overused in 90s art. But there you go.
Mm.
Uh, but that was the first one. And then from then on, I just kept going. Uh, and somehow you're able to do that. Like there was bookshops, I mean, like, I think Brighton had, we worked out one time at new bookshops. It had something like 14 or something, 15, I don't know. And now Brighton's got, I think, two new bookshops,
Right.
and it's like, but you had so many bookshops. People read books, and the internet was just like slow and clunky, so people weren't reading stuff online. They were still buying physical books, and so I came along at the right time where our generation were literate, who were interested in culture, were buying books, and I was able to write them. So it worked really well. So
Did it set you
yeah,
up as an authority in that field then? Is that how people looked at you after this book?
I mean, yeah, in the same way that you're an authority on craft. I mean, like, you look in the mirror and you're like, yeah, whatever. But other people look at you and think, wow,
Yeah.
you wrote the book. Yeah. So I mean, I think yeah, that made me the authority on this stuff. But I mean, I always, I'm torn on this one. I like being an authority, and you might feel the same way. You also want somebody else to write about the same thing, so you're not the only one, because it's like a conversation then.
Mm.
It's like, I'd
Mm.
like to have a conversation and be the only one, you know?
Yeah.
Because my readings are just my readings, you know? It's like somebody else could come along and write anything and it would be better, worse, doesn't make a difference. It would just be their version of things, you know?
Totally, totally. I was always hyper aware of that when I was reviewing gigs, just thinking, yeah, who cares what I think, quite frankly? I'm not sure I do, never mind anybody else should. Yeah,
Yeah,
so yeah.
exactly. And I think, and you must be aware of that with your craft book. There's one other book, right? The Day the Country Died, The History of Anarcho Punk, right?
Mm, mm.
And at me, there's a couple of other books which touch on some of the same things, but not really. It's like books on like the whole of the 80s downtown film scene and stuff. But yeah, it's interesting. But it's yeah, you become this expert, which is a weird place to be because you don't really feel like an expert. Uh, but then it's even weirder because you meet someone and they'll tell you something and you'll be like the voice in your head saying, "No, they got the date wrong."
Yeah, yeah, I
So,
understand what you're saying there. So you've written this death tripping book about transgressive film. Uh,
yeah.
where do you go once you've done that then? I mean, you don't keep writing books about, well, or do you keep writing books about transgressive film? It's a
So
strange
look,
kind of launching pad, isn't it?
it is. It's like a launching pad to nowhere. No, look, I wrote about the next one was the one on beatniks and film, and then I
Okay.
wrote about and then I wrote about artists, and I've written a lot about art and a lot about kind of counterculture stuff. But the transgressive thing just kind of is there hovering all the time in the background. So every now and again I'll write another book about film and I'm like, it's just like a similar world. Yeah, it's like so, it's like it's the same but different, you know? And I think that that's the thing is like a lot you your interests are your interests, right? And even though they change, there's still some in some way something around which they evolve. So like so you did your book on craft and you're not writing another book on craft, but you're taking that, those ideas that you got from that, and now you're interviewing people about their lives and about their experience of the counterculture and creativity, which is the same but different.
Yes.
You know, it's
Yeah. There's a thread.
like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Uh, a thread is a metaphor that I'm not sure I can go with because that assumes a linearity. And I one of my books, I said that it was like writing it a book. My thinking process was like a dog eating its own vomit, returning to eat its own vomit. So I just keep on going back and thinking about the same things in different ways.
Right.
So, but I think, yeah, thread assumes a kind of teleology that I don't have, but I don't think there's a beginning and a middle and an end. There's just I do the work, and afterwards I'm like, oh, that's kind of a bit like this, or oh, that's really different from everything else I've done.
Right.
But I don't, you know. So like if I write about if I write about an artist I like, a photographer, I mean, I've written a bunch of introductions for photography books, and they're very different from the films I like, wrote about or anything. But they're also not. It's that what I'm writing about and the things that I'm seeing in them, the I guess the challenges to the person looking at it, or the way the artist is challenging perception, or the way that the themes of the photographs, all those things, in some way, are kind of engaged in what I've already engaged with, even though they're different, because that's who I am, And there's a kind of tension because on one level, I don't think you are anything. On one level, I think that we don't have an identity that's fixed. Our identity changes, but that doesn't mean that there's not these kind of points that, in some way, you kind of flow around. Like I
Mm.
guess the point. I don't know. I'm getting my metaphors mixed, but it's just in some way there's some sense of like there's not a self. You are what's around you and your influences and the people around you, and all this stuff is you're developing continually. But at the same time, your developments don't forget what's behind you and aren't necessarily your motion's not necessarily a forward motion. You may circle around again or whatever.
Is it
So
your whole world that kind of thing? By which I mean, are you going to sort of sneak out and watch the latest Indiana Jones film? Do you keep a
oh,
foot in the normal world?
yeah, I live in the cinema. No, because I mean I look. No one's going to believe this. I'm looking forward to the Barbie film. It's like I'm no, I'm totally open to stuff. I so what? One of the big disadvantages of the growing up in that post-punk world, and especially that kind of crafts world, with a cynicism towards everything, the mainstream. Yeah, it all sucks. You know,
Mm.
and actually, yeah, you get to a certain point as you're growing up, and it doesn't suck. You like. I look back and I don't look back. I mean, I was aware at the time, but things that were mainstream but were really good. And you can't to dislike the mainstream is to in some way it's kind of naive and it's kind of fun when you're 15, but not when you're an adult. So no, I can totally go and watch. I don't know if I'm going to see Indiana Jones because it's 3 hours long. I'm not sure if my sense of humor is going to last that long. But no, I live around the corner from a cinema, and I go to the cinema a lot. One of my things that I do for a living is I program film, so I have to see lots of film, and like and this is why I'm kind of wary about talking about transgression in some way. It's because I spend a lot of time having to tell people, look, I did write these books. I also, I'm totally able to watch a Barbie film. I'm totally able to talk about, other things. It's like, yeah, you can be a pizza chef, but it doesn't mean you only eat pizza.
Yeah, yeah. Well put, well put.
It's like I'm my tastes are very open, and I'm very happy and willing to watch pretty much anything, and I enjoy it. I mean, I can I can talk about any kind of uh, piece of art or culture and find something in it I like. It's I think that as you get older, you become more aware of that. Like there is good. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think the
totally.
other thing is that I'm aware of that's become more apparent as you get older is I think this goes back to those kind of again those debates in the late 70s, early 80s around the authenticity of rock and roll versus like disco. And of course, you know, there's nothing wrong with disco music, It's like what's wrong with dancing, you know?
Yeah.
My 14-year-old self is squirming to hear my adult self say that. But there's nothing I'm not gonna go out and go to a disco tonight, but I got no problem with disco music. I got no problem with people dancing. I've got no problem with people liking stuff that I don't like, whatever it is, because you grow up. But yeah, I have spent my life explaining to people that even though I wrote a book about this weird film, I'm really happy to go and watch something else. You know.
Have you always got a professional hat on? A friend of mine who was a music journalist said to me once that he refused to review films because every time he went to a gig now, he was kind of reviewing it in his head, even if he wasn't actually reviewing it, for a publication or whatever. And he didn't want the same thing to happen with films. He didn't want to just sit there analyzing them the whole time. He wanted to just sit there and enjoy them. So if you go to like the Barbie film, can you just sort of turn off and just watch it like most people would?
Look, I think that's a really interesting question. Uh, I think that there's two answers to it. Yes, I can turn my brain off to watch something. But also, when you say like most people would, I don't know if that's true. I think most people watch things quite critically. I think most people are aware of more complex things in culture. And I think that there's I kind of yeah I talk to especially kind of LGBTQI plus people will have really nuanced queer readings around a text that you know you might not spot if you're like in the straight audience.
Yeah,
Uh, so I think that I'm sure if you talk to other people about the way that things are represented, they're going to have different readings. So I don't think I'm able because I can write books. I have a special ability to read a text. I think other people are equally able to, uh, and they all have their own nuanced readings. And I think that's a really important thing. But that said, I can also watch something and just turn my brain off and enjoy it as well.
yeah,
But then if I'm asked a question about it, there's kind of a throttle in there. Oh yes.
yeah,
So
yeah. Sure.
I can watch Indiana Jones and enjoy it, but then there's a voice in my head saying you're going to have to talk about the representation of gender and race in this. So I can do both.
Okay,
But
well,
I think
that's
we all can. I think we all can. Like I don't think anyone's really a passive consumer of culture. I think we all read this cult. We all read it in different ways, and we all bring our experiences to it. And I think people can be quite sophisticated in their readings of things. And I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the representation of violence.
yes.
Like people read stuff in a really complicated ways, and they bring their own experiences and their own knowledge and their own sense of who they are and their own cultural identity and so on to something. And I think all that plays into it.
Okay. Thank you. That's really interesting. So two things happen. I don't know enough about your story to know which of these happens first. But you start curating stuff, and also you move to Australia. That, which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Curating. So when my first book came out, one of the things you realize is not enough people have seen the films, and my publisher had a whole pile to sell. So I was on the phone to the filmmakers, and we were traveling around showing the films. And it became really apparent that A, I could do that, and B, people were going to come. So I started, doing that more with films. And I'd already done it, as I said earlier, with bands and music and spoken words. So I realized that it was basically variants of the same thing.
Right.
So I was doing that. And then I started working with I didn't work with anyone. I approached the Horse Hospital in London, which is a fantastic space. And I said, look, I got ideas. And they said, come and do film shows. And I did some film shows with them. And at some point, I did an art show there. And I can't honestly remember what the first one was, but I did a couple of art shows there. And I realized that, film art, I can do all, it's, I mean, it's not the same, but there's enough of a comparison between the two. So I started, putting on films. I was only going to do like an exhibition or something or things like that. And then I was invited to Australia to do a retrospective film festival side program of Beatnik films for my second book. So I came to Australia, to Brisbane. I was really unsure about it, but somebody had said you should always, at some point in my life, you should always go where you're never going to be able to afford to go, never going to go again. So I thought I'll go there. I went to Brisbane. I didn't think much of it. Why am I going to Brisbane? And I got there and it was like, oh, these people are really cool. It's really nice. It's sunny. People are nice. I had a really good time. And people, really got what I was talking about. I felt that like I met some really good people there who are still good friends of mine. And that was in 2000 or 99, 2000, that kind of time. I think 2000. And I really, really had a good time. And then I was there for like 10 days, went back to England. I was thinking, those people are cool. And I was, we were chatting on the emergent internet, on email and pre-social media. And then I was invited back to do another film show. I think I did a tour, did some film shows. And again, that went really well. And I went Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and then Hobart in Tasmania. And I had a really good time. And I met some really cool people in all these places, but especially in Sydney. And I went back. I think I went back the next time, the following year. And it must be 1999, 2000, and 2001. Because I was in Australia in 2001 when the terrorist attacks happened on 9/11. So I remember watching it on TV. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm on the opposite side of the planet from where I need to get back to, and there's no planes flying anymore. So it was a weird few days. But then I came down, I think it was the third time I came down, I met my partner here. And we moved together back to England. But it became really clear that I couldn't stay in Brighton anymore. I couldn't be there anymore. It was a really good base to go to other places from, but I couldn't just have gone through all I've gone through and meet someone and then go back to Brighton. And we decided that I would have. Well, it's more complex than that, but basically, I ended up applying to be Australian and becoming Australian. So yeah, we settled in Sydney, and it's that classic thing, like and again, it feeds into everything I've been saying about feeling like an outsider and so on. I end up as a, you know, ostensibly an outsider in Australia because
Mm.
I'm not Australian in like the kind of sense that it's on my passport, but I'm not. I wasn't raised here. I have a different relationship to the sun and stuff like that. Like it gets sunny and I'm outside saying, "Oh, it's sunny! It's so exciting!" And everyone else like put sunblock on.
Yeah, yeah,
Exaggerate, but not much. I get and then also weird things like I get really homesick for rain. I wish it was raining. I wish it was cold. Stuff that you never think you miss in England. So yeah, it's kind of strange. But then I moved here, and uh, within a couple of years, I had the gig programming a film festival. So that was good, and then doing other stuff as well. And then I've got a child. Well, now a teenager a mid teenager who is Australian. So we stayed here. And I think of, do you want to go back to England? And every now and again I think about it, and then we go over for a month, and we're like, nah. I
yeah,
don't, I, I don't think you can go back. And I think that's the thing. I think once you've left anywhere, you can't go back. Like, you have too much baggage. You have too much history there in some way. And I feel that. So when I'm in Brighton, I feel exceptionally kind of uncomfortable. In part because like I'll be walking down the road and I'm like, where's that? Oh, it's gone. And people are like, yeah, that went 15 years ago.
yeah.
And there's that phrase, was it this? I've got to hate using quotes. The past is a different place. People do things differently there. And to me, so when I'm in England, I'm like, well, why aren't you guys doing this? And they were like, well, we don't do that anymore. Because my British head is stuck in 2003. And that's
Yeah.
20 years ago. Of course, people don't do that anymore. Uh, so it's a different place from the place I left.
Yes.
It's as anywhere would be after 20 years. Uh, but actually, I finally left everything, all my jobs, got my Australia. I got, I think I got a right to remain, and then citizenship. But it was about 2008, 2006 or 2008, whenever the global financial crash happened, was literally the month I left the country. So I missed all of austerity. So now when I go back to Britain, I'm always kind of totally freaked out by, what's happened. I'm sure I'm not the only person who said that.
Mm.
Like, it seems so different. And I find it quite traumatic in a way.
What does your life look like now then? What's obviously I can't really ask you for a typical day given what you do, but when you kind of curate something, what does that involve exactly?
Uh, my days is, look, because I teach at university some of the time, so I do that. And then when I'm programming the film festival, I'm watching films, talking to filmmakers or film distributors, and then talk to my colleagues and say, I want to put this on. And they say, well, will anyone come? And I'm like, yeah, we'll pull a crowd. And then I have to think, oh, maybe it won't. We should do it anyway. And then we have these arguments. And then after 8 months, 9 months, there's this whole pile of film on the spreadsheet, and they're all locked in. And I have to start working out when they're going to be on. And then we put them all on, and then people come, hopefully. So we're doing it again next week. We'll find out. But it's like my day. I mean, I wake up at 6 every morning. I'm normally on my phone doing social media and chatting to people and chasing up things for a couple of hours. Then I make breakfast for everyone. Then I just sit and work. And about half my day will be devoted to film stuff or whatever I'm working on, and the other half I'm not very good at writing. I tend to write in fits and bursts, but I've always got notebooks around me. You can't see it because I've got my camera carefully out of focus, but I've always got a notebook near me that I scribble in. So I spend about a certain amount of time writing and a certain amount of time watching films, a certain amount of time teaching. But I think there's that thing about DIY culture, and maybe that's I said at the beginning the American hardcore thing spoke to me it's not like I was a particular fan of the music even, but they had that kind of work ethic thing that I think is, on one hand it's kind of nonsense, but on the other hand I kind of get it. And I've always had a very strong work ethic, like get up and do your work and just do stuff.
Mm.
I've never, when I was in my teens, I sat around doing nothing for a while, but mostly I've been very kind of motivated. And I think that if you're going to work in the arts or in anything, but certainly if you're freelance, you have to be motivated. You have to be able to get up and do it. You can't just hope somebody else will do it. And I think that's something that's ingrained in me from that kind of DIY attitude that. And I think that's something that affects how I work and how I think about working.
I'd like to finish off by asking you a little bit. Right at the start, you talked about challenging domination, which I thought was quite a fascinating kind of phrase and indeed concept, really, that all these counterculture things were challenging the dominant culture, perhaps. Um, how do you think that's gone over the? I mean, we're both quite a lot older now than we used to be when we were young, so to speak. Where do you think we're at regarding challenging domination, regarding domination itself?
Look, I think there's always going to be. This is why I don't go to the anarchy and peace thing. I think that's naive, but I do think there's always the possibility of challenging things, of challenging established orders, and I think that that still happens, and I think that I see it in a lot with you see younger people. There's a whole, they're very politically engaged around things like the environment, around LGBTQI plus rights, and so on. And that's great. I mean, they're doing stuff, and I like that. And I would hope that I would still be challenging, the forces of kind of culturally conservative forces, and I would hope that that's a lesson that we got from all that stuff, was just to not accept things that are unacceptable, you know.
Yeah, that's
So,
a great phrase. Yeah, yeah.
and I think that goes to, and how maybe in the end, what you do is you just live your life with that in mind. That, like if I see, I don't know, if there's a news story of a particular political angle or something, to be attuned to, the power structures behind it, be attuned to who's benefit. I don't mean some kind of conspiratorial sense. I mean in the most literal sense, like, this story is being told from this angle, but why,
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that awareness, and I think that's something that maybe our generation we're quite aware of that in a way, because, you know, because of that whole kind of post-punk thing, but also because of, as I said earlier, those bookshops we go to, you were aware of alternatives, you were aware of, a longer history of a counterculture, of people who were against things, who were challenged the established order and orthodoxy. And, I think that, I hope that, what we've done, somewhere someone's inspired by it, to have, the same questions. I see these, I see enough young people to see that there is people who are challenging stuff and who don't accept things. I think that's good. I'm glad that still happens. And every now and again I meet someone who says, "Oh, I really like your books, and they made me think about this in a different way." And I'm like, "That's great, it's made me happy." Of course, I meet people who seem to have totally misread my books, but that's, what do you do?
Oh yeah, quite, quite.
But I think, I think it, I think, I guess in one level maybe, and it's easier to say than do, but you try and live as an example to yourself, like,
Yeah.
Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, but I try to. I think that's all you can do.
Yeah, that's great. That seems like a good point to wrap it up. And like you say about hope someone somewhere has been inspired. I hope someone somewhere gets inspired by the stuff you said today, because I think it's been fascinating, a really good chat. And I would like to thank you, Jack Sargent. Oh, if anybody wants to know about you and stuff, the sales pitch bit, do you have a website, or is there somewhere
Oh,
else to go?
look, I'm on all the usual social media. Uh, and I'm easy to find on social media. Just Jack Sargent on Facebook and all those things. So you can always just send me messages. I do actually read messages. So I'm pretty easy to find. I've got a website. I've got to actually do something with it. Been remiss on dealing with it.
Okay, okay. I'll leave it there, then I'll have a chat with you after I finish recording as well. But Jack Sargent, thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
Well.